All right, welcome to our second set of notes in section B. Again, we're talking kind of migrating from radio to TV. And the next thing we're going to talk about is what's called the television freeze. We have people, once television came out, TV stations across the country really saw an increase in station production, building TV stations and so forth. So the demand for broadcast licenses really outpaced the available bandwidth space that they actually had. So the FCC had to do something to kind of control it. We kind of saw that in radio as well too, but now we're really seeing it in the TV industry. So the FCC basically, instead of granting more licenses, they imposed what they call a freeze. Now, for your notes, it's very important to underline this somewhere, but the freeze lasted for 4 years, from 1948 to 1952. And so the FCC implemented this freeze to figure out what they were going to do or what the television industry needed to do in order to succeed. They didn't want to have the confusion and the mess that radio had when it started up and people started getting licenses. So the FCC basically imposed this freeze from 1948 to 1952 and basically halted everything. You couldn't get licenses, you couldn't build a new radio station, or I'm sorry, TV station. And so they kind of did this major halt on television production until they could figure out, what they could do. And it basically took them 4 years to figure out what the next steps were going to be. One of the things that we saw as far as television growth was by 1952 we had about 15 million homes in the United States that had TVs, and that was a huge growth. So the FCC knew that they had to do something and do something fairly quick. So in 1952, which is basically the end of the freeze, the FCC issued something called the Sixth Report. And basically the Sixth Report order contained a lot of things that needed to happen in the TV industry. We're going to cover just a few here. The first one, it was basically they allocated 70 new channels in the television spectrum, and it was in what they called the ultra high frequency range, or the UHF band. So if any of you guys have heard probably from your parents about their old TV sets that they had, you may have heard the term UHF and VHF. So we had VHF radio or television from basically the inception of television. But the FCC created 70 new channels, and they were allocated in this ultra-high frequency range, thinking that that would be possibly enough extra channels or enough extra frequencies to handle the demand for television. The other thing that they did was they set aside 242 stations throughout the U.S. Now, this isn't channels, but these are stations throughout the U.S. Set aside for non-commercial / educational television. So this is where your public broadcasting came in and some other things. They also mandated, the FCC mandated, that we have a uniform television station class. All right. So before this, they were all over the place, and we had different powers and strengths and different things. So they basically said, look, we're gonna mandate that from this point on, all TV stations are under the same power. They did provide for some differences in transmission powers and antenna height depending on where they were. If you were had a TV station in a rural area, they let you go a little bit above and beyond it. But for the majority of the country, especially in the high populated areas, it was very regulated and uniform. The theory behind all this was basically to regulate the power for each station's transmitter, was to help the UHF stations basically get a foothold over VHS, because up until this point, like I said, all the TV sets that were built and all the TV stations that were built were VHS. And now that we have now introduced 70 new channels for the UHF bandwidth, we needed to really regulate the power, because VHF was a lot stronger than UHF when you had an antenna at a TV station. So the FCC tried to regulate the power for each station's transmitter in order to help the UHF stations get a foothold. Existing VHF stations obviously became the mainstay for television, and they basically had a 4-year head start because of the freeze. Nothing was built for UHF until after the freeze, because we didn't have any channel allocations for that. During the freeze, during that 4 years, any TV sets that were built only had VHF tuners built into them. So it wasn't until after the freeze where UHF was there, and so we didn't see any TV sets built with UHF channels built into them until after the freeze. And still, that was a problem because, as we'll see here in a few minutes with some of our notes, the TV sets didn't have dual tuners. You either bought a TV set that had a VHF tuner, or you bought a TV set that had a UHF tuner. And you couldn't get, if you had a UHF TV set, you couldn't get VHF channels. If you had a VHF TV set, you couldn't get UHF channels. So it was really kind of a hodgepodge of what you were trying to do. The FCC created something now called the All Channels Receiver Bill. It was passed in 1962. And basically what that meant was that from this point forward, all television sets that were built had to be equipped with both the UHF and the VHF tuner built into it. The FCC thought once this happened, UHF would then really take off, but it really didn't. We really didn't see an insurgence or a strong growth in UHF until around the mid to late 1970s. And basically that was because people still had a lot of TV sets out there with just a VHF tuner built into it. So in order to get UHF, you either had to buy an older TV set that had just UHF, or you had to buy the new TV sets that had both tuners. But in either case, you had to throw away your old TV set or get a second one. And back then, people didn't do that like they do today. Migrating to color television was the next big step in the television industry. And believe it or not, our first guy that we talked about is working. He kind of had the idea of color television way back in 1925, and he actually filed a patent for it. But his attempt to produce color television failed. He just had the idea behind color television, but everything that he tried, his patent that he took out, it didn't work. In 1950, the FCC authorized CBS and their television technology to become the national standard. So CBS Network actually created a color television system that worked, and they were basically the first guys on the block to make it work. And so the FCC authorized the CBS color television system to be the national standard for color television set. CBS began broadcasting on 5 East Coast stations in 1951. That was their first programming. Now, not all the programming was in color, just certain CBS programs were in color back then. Similar to the VHF-UHF problem where people had VHF TVs and didn't want to buy an extra TV set, the same thing happened with color. If you had a color TV, or if you had a black and white TV set, which everybody did at that point, in order to see the programs in color, you had to buy a color TV set. So at that time, we had about 10.5 million black and white TV sets that had been sold. So it was really hard for color television to really take off in the early 1950s, mid-1950s. Even in the early 60s, it was tough because you basically had a brand new black and white TV set that worked. And they lasted forever, basically, and so you didn't really want to go out and buy another TV set. Color television production itself was halted during the Korean War. Obviously, we had another major conflict on hand, and so a lot of the resources went towards that war and its production. Now, RCA eventually came out with their color TV standard, and they basically sued CBS over their color system. And the primary reason was CBS's color television system did not work on black and white TV sets. And I'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But the RCA color system was basically a better color system, and by 1953, the FCC approved RCA color system to be the new national standard. So basically, CBS had the color standard for about 2.5, 3 years, and then RCA came in and proved to the FCC that their system worked. And basically, the main reason that the RCA system was a better system is because it was compatible with black and white TV sets. Now, it didn't mean if you had a black and white TV, now you could get color all of a sudden. But what it meant was if you bought a new color TV set, you could also get black and white programming on there. So it worked with both color and black and white, and that was the biggest thing with the RCA system. By March 1954, Westinghouse started selling their color TV sets for about $1,295. RCA had a smaller, less expensive Victor TV set, and that was about $1,000. So you see the price point of new TVs haven't really changed over the years. I mean, unless you go up to an 80 or 90-inch flat screen, high def, ultra high def TV set, that's $5,000. But your basic base TV set was still $1,000 back then, and it's still $500 to $1,000 today. But $1,000 back in the 1950s was like spending $5,000 or $10,000 today. It was a very expensive. So we only had a few people in the United States that could afford it, and so that was the other reason that we saw sluggish sales in its initial stages of color television. A couple important dates for your notes to remember. I'm going to go through these semi-fast, so you can just kind of pause the video and write this stuff down. The first color television coverage of a World Series happened on September 28th, 1955. The TV show Bonanza began televising their shows in black and white, but on September 12th of 1959, they began broadcasting in color. And that was two big important TV programmings that people really watched. And so once they switched over to color, people really started taking notice. But probably the most important TV program to switch over to color and to really show the consumers that, wow, we should really spend the extra money and buy a color TV set was the premiere of Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color. Now, Walt Disney had the TV show, but when they started producing their shows in color, they changed the TV show name to the Walt Disney Wonderful World of Color. And that happened in September of 1961. And that analysts really pinpoint to the turning point to persuade consumers that color TV was here to stay and that we wanted to watch these Walt Disney programs in color. And so the only way to do it was to go out and buy a color TV set. So we really see from 1961 onward, the purchasing of color TV sets really started to explode. The two famous cartoons of the day, the Flintstones and the Jetsons, started airing their cartoons in color on ABC in the fall of '62. And basically, by 1966, NBC became the first network to convert all of its programs over to color. It wasn't until about late '72 that color TV set sales exceeded black and white TV sales. So we really do see from from 1961 to 1972, so about 11-year span, it really took about that long for color TV sets to really gain enough momentum to outpace black and white TV sales. And so we really had a long period of time. And during the same time, this 11 years, the TV shows eventually transgraded from black and white to color. And so by 1972, every TV show on the air was in color. Going through some statistics as well. Write these down. These are all obviously fair game for the next exam. In 1965, we only show about 10% of U.S. households having a color TV set. That increased to 25% in about 1968. A year later, it jumped to 33%. 71 showed a 48% increase. And believe it or not, by 2011, 95% of the homes in the United States had color TV sets. And that figure blows me away because the most interesting part about that figure is that 5% of the TV sets in the United States by 2011 still had black and white TV sets. I don't know why that stands out to me as an odd figure, but I just would think by 2011 there wouldn't be any black and white TV sets in the country, but apparently there still is. An interesting side note to that, in 1953, Wood TV in Grand Rapids, which is Channel 8 here in town in Grand Rapids, became the first station in Michigan to broadcast in color. So if you hear any trivia facts about that, Channel 8 in Grand Rapids was the first TV station in the country to do that. Although you might hear some controversy about a TV station in Detroit thinking they were, but if you look back in any kind of history books, Wood TV gets that accolade on that one. Wood TV8 was first called WLAV-TV in its inception, and WLAV-TV had been one of the last construction permits issued before the TV freeze. So Wood TV8 has been here basically from the beginning of television, give or take 1 or 2 years. So they actually had been granted one of the last television permits just prior to the TV freeze. Now we talk about UHF and VHF channels and all that stuff, and it really doesn't pertain anymore because of the digital realm, and the channel selections are completely different now. But in the UHF and VHF television, we had two sets of channels, if you will. Now this is very important to put in your notes because it'll be on the exam. If you had a television set that had just a VHF tuner, all you could get were channels 2 through 13. Okay? If you had a TV set that just had a UHF channel selection, or if you had a TV set that got both, the UHF channels were channels 14 through 69. Very important numbers to write down. So now we've got our TV stations built. We have color TV. We need some more programming because television is really gaining some strength. So one of the things that we have to do, we have to develop programming for television. And one of the things that the early television programmers did was they looked at how radio was working and their radio programming. And basically they copied everything that they did from radio because radio was a proven programming technology. Everything worked. The economic structure worked. So basically, in the beginning days, they didn't want to reinvent the wheel. They just wanted to use what worked, and radio worked. And so they basically patterned everything after radio. They patterned the networks and how they worked, the show time slots when things were popular during the day. They used what worked with radio. They migrated to TV, show genres, even the characters. All the stuff that worked in radio, they translated to TV. And as a matter of fact, a lot of radio shows then became television shows. We see programming trends in television. The television comedy was a absolute home run hit for these guys. And by 1965, we had 35 sitcoms on primetime television. Sitcoms, comedy television, was actually such a huge hit that it basically was the only genre that had top 10 rated programs every year between 1949 and 2005. It's still a major programming factor still today, from the conception of radio all the way through television. Television comedy, or just comedy in general, was a huge impact on both radio and television. When we talk about programming, we also have to talk about time slots. Now, for the most part, local TV stations can do whatever they want throughout the day. We have two important time slots that we want to talk about. The first one's called local access, and that's from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. So if you're a network affiliate for NBC, you have some other things going on. You might have some soap operas or other programming that you might get provided by the network during the day. But the 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. time slot was always allocated for local access. So if you were strictly only showing network programming during the day, and then you broke away maybe for your local news, but then went back to national news, you always had that 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. time slot available. Now, this is for local television stations. This isn't for ESPN or any of the other things you see on DirecTV or cable. This is just for your local TV stations. So the time slot between 7 and 8 p.m. is a very lucrative time slot for the TV stations. They can do their own programming during this time slot and basically make a lot of money during this time slot. The other one we have is primetime, and obviously this goes in hand with the networks, and that's 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. So we have local access from 7 to 8, primetime is 8 to 11, and if you're a network affiliate, the 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. time slot is where the network programming would happen. But it's also a very lucrative time slot for not only the networks but also for the local TV stations, because they can sell ad time during this time. And this is where our highest rated programs fall, between the 8 and 11 p.m. time slot fall into things. Now we're going to talk about some different types of TV shows. We're going to talk about syndication here in a few minutes. And when we talk about those time slots, or those syndicated programs, we're going to talk about when those possibly could air either in the local access or prime time. One of the first innovative television shows on TV as far as the comedy go was Desilu Productions. And Desilu Productions was affiliated with a TV show called I Love Lucy. It basically was a television show that was organized around a comedic actress. Her name was Lucille Ball. I'm sure most of you people have heard about her. The Desilu Productions was basically formed to produce good television shows. They had I Love Lucy, they had a couple other TV shows on there, but Lucille Ball basically owned Desilu Productions, and she had a lot of influential power in Hollywood and in the TV industry itself. We see her as a very strong business person, and not only a business person, but a businesswoman. She was really the front runner for women in this industry. She actually demanded that her husband be the co-star, which brought in some interesting aspects to that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But Desilu Productions developed a new show and a new production style, and we'll talk about that here. Desilu Productions basically was the first television company to develop market research. They wanted to know exactly what the audience wanted, what the audience liked, what they disliked. And so they used this market research to develop their show programming titles and what they were going to discuss in the show and all the comic relief in the show. It was all developed around this marketing research. Was really never really done to any extent until Desilu Productions. It's done all the time now, but it wasn't really until Lucille Ball started Desilu Productions and they started doing this stuff. One of the things when Lucille Ball demanded that her husband be on the show, that was the first time that we saw kind of an interracial cast. He was from Cuba, and so she kind of crossed some boundaries in a good way. We also see the Desilu. Basically, up until this point, most of the TV shows, if not all of them, were filmed in New York. Desilu Productions basically was one of the first TV shows to be filmed in front of a live studio audience, but they also took it out to California for the first time. They also shot with a 3-camera setup in front of a live studio audience, which was rarely done. Up in that point, it was a single camera shot. They would shoot one scene with one person, stop, turn the camera to the other person, almost like a film would be produced. This was almost like a live TV show, if you will. The I Love Lucy show was the #1 show in its first year. And again, I mentioned this earlier, it marks the first shift to Hollywood from New York. So She moved the show out, or moved the production out to Hollywood. And because of the success of that, we see a lot of TV shows moving out to Hollywood after this point. We talked about syndication a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail here. But Desi Lou Productions and I Love Lucy really allowed for the syndication of reruns. So I Love Lucille Ball was really a smart business lady. She understood that there was a potential to make money from her TV show running in syndication. And up until this point, we really didn't know what syndication really was. There was no thought process of maybe rerunning our shows later. But she had the sense, or the foresight enough to know that if my show runs again later in a rerun, that me as an actress and my rest of my cast should get paid again. And so she developed this pay structure and syndication for all of her reruns, which was an amazing step, because once that proved that worked, then all the other TV shows after that point began doing that. Some interesting facts about the I Love Lucy show. When Lucy was pregnant, the network censors did not let her say that she was, they couldn't use the word pregnant, let's put it that way. She had to say that she was expecting. The word pregnant was a no-no. It was like vulgarity. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the radio stuff became TV stuff. The I Love Lucy show actually began as a radio show called My Favorite Husband around 1948. Another fact that they couldn't do in the I Love Lucy show is when they would show the bedroom scenes, they couldn't show that they had one bed in their bedroom. Even though they were married, the TV censors just wouldn't let that happen. So if you ever go back and watch an old rerun of I Love Lucy and they show a bedroom scene, you will always see Lucy and her husband in their own single beds in the bedroom. Just what the censors did. They just didn't think it was right to show a husband and wife, even though they were married, in the same bed. So it kind of shows you where we've come with TV network censors since then. Kind of crazy. All right, so we talked about Lucille Ball working in the syndication and getting paid for it. Let's talk a little bit more about the actual syndication process of itself. Basically, the definition of syndication is the domestic and or foreign releasing of a program. So you as a television producer or the owner of a television show, you have the right to not sell it, but lease it to another TV station or even a network possibility. And that is syndication. We have a lot of, I've just put up a couple of syndicated programs, Friends, King of the Hill, Star Trek, and you can name a whole list of different shows that are in syndication. But when you sell into syndication, you're basically selling it to one TV station per market. So if I'm the owner of Friends and I go into the Grand Rapids, West Michigan, Kalamazoo market, I take it to all the TV stations and basically say whoever wants to buy it first gets it, but you have exclusivity to that TV show for the term of the contract. So what that prevents happening is Channel 8 buying Friends, and then Channel 3 also buying Friends, and then you running Friends twice in the same market. So for the most part, syndicated lease contracts give you exclusivity. They also give you the right of first refusal when your contract is up. So if you already have bought in Friends this year, when the contract ends, you have the right of first refusal to get it again the following year. But if you turn it down, then another station in the market can actually get it. Syndication was a huge, huge moneymaker for production companies. A lot of times their programs in the first run on network made money but didn't make a lot of money, and in many cases didn't make enough money to recoup any losses that they had in their production. So syndication, they make in some cases sometimes make more money and kind of recover a lot of their losses. Now the one cool thing about syndication is the local TV station that buys the syndicated program can sell advertising space or slots in the syndicated program. So syndicated producers give time slots within their program for the local TV stations to add commercials. Now there's also pre-sold syndicated commercials already built into the program that the syndicators have already sold, but then they give the TV stations a couple opportunities throughout that half hour to sell their own commercials. Now we're going to talk about two types of syndications, and they're very important to make sure you understand this in your notes, because these two that I'm going to show you get missed quite a bit in the exam, so I want to make sure you understand this. The first one is called the first run syndication, and these are shows like Entertainment Tonight, Wheel of Fortune, and Oprah. These are shows that are produced specifically to go into syndication from day one. All right, they didn't air on network TV first and then bring it back to syndication. These aren't reruns. First run to syndication are programs specifically produced from day one to be sold to a TV station. They usually run in what's called stripes. So if a local TV station buys Oprah, for example, they'll usually air that Oprah show every day at the same time, Monday through Friday. All right, so that's first run syndication. So however you need to make that work in your notes, just know that first run syndication are shows that were specifically produced to go to syndication from day one. The other syndicated programs are called off-network syndications, and these are TV shows that were originally produced for network television and for whatever reason either stopped on their network or left network for whatever reason and then started becoming sold to local TV stations. So these are the TV shows like Friends, MASH, Star Trek, you name it, The Office. So off-network syndication, and you can maybe use that as the key term in your notes to try to remember this. It started on network and then left network for whatever reason and then became a syndicated pro. There are some shows that are still on network syndication, or I'm sorry, that are still airing on network and also airing in syndication. We see that once in a while. I think probably one of the last ones I remember seeing was 2.5 Men. 2.5 Men is still on network TV, but it also is the old shows are in syndication. So you see that sometimes as well too. The off-network syndicated shows typically air during that fringe time of local access between 7 and 8 p.m. Monday through Friday. That's where most TV stations will air the off-network syndications. The first-run syndication shows are run, can run in that 7 to 8 p.m. time slot, but they also sometimes are run at the 4 o'clock hour or the 3 o'clock hour in the afternoon, depending on what the show is and depending on what the market research tells people who's watching those shows. So that's kind of a difference between that. But syndicated shows or the reruns typically are shown during that 7 to 8 p.m. time slot. All right. So that's the end of the slide for this set of notes. We'll get into more syndication, some more TV stuff in the next set of notes. Have a good week.